Robert Lewis Stevenson's Kidnapped was published in 1886. But the story takes place in Scotland more than 100 years before that, soon after bonnie Prince Charlie's attempt to seize the British crown. The prince sailed from France in 1745 and landed on the west coast of Scotland. The men of the Highland clans rallied to him, and his army marched south into England to depose King George and restore the House of Stuart to the throne. They got as far as Derby, but then began a long retreat, and when they finally stood their ground at Culloden near Inverness in April 1746, they were totally defeated. The prince escaped with his life, but many thousands of his soldiers were killed, and the redcoats of King George's army then set about the savage and systematic destruction of the Highland clan system. The story of Kidnap opens, though, many miles south of the mountains in the Scottish lowlands.
I will begin the story of my adventures with a certain morning early in the month of June, the year of grace, 1751, when I took the key for the last time out of the door of my father's house. The sun began to shine upon the summit of the hills as I went down the road, and by the time I'd come as far as the manse, the blackbirds were whistling in the garden lilacs, and the mist that hung around the valley in the time of the dawn was beginning to arise and die away. Mr. Campbell, the minister of Essendine, was waiting for me by the garden gate.
"Well, Davy, lad," said he, "I'll go with you as far as the ford to set you on your way."
And we began to walk forward in silence.
Are you sorry to leave Essendine?" he said after a while.
"Why, sir," said I, "if I knew where I was going or what was likely to become of me, I would tell you candidly. Essendine is a good place indeed, and I've been very happy there, but then I've never been anywhere else. My father and mother, since they are both dead, I shall be no nearer to in Essendine than in the kingdom of Hungary. And to speak truth, if I thought I had a chance to better myself where I was going, I would go with a good will."
"Aye," said Mr. Campbell. "Very well, Davy. Then it behoves me to tell your fortune. Oh, so far as I may. When your mother was gone, and your father, the worthy Christian man, began to sicken for his end, he gave me in charge a certain letter, which he said was your inheritance. So soon, says he, as I'm gone, and the house is redd up and the gear disposed of, all of which, Davy, hath been done, give my boy this letter into his hand, and start him off to the House of Shaws, not far from Cramond. That is the place that I came from, he said. And it's where it befits that my boy should return."
"The House of Shaws?" I cried. "What had my poor father to do with the House of Shaws?"
"Nay," said Mr. Campbell, "or who can tell that for a surety? But the name of that family, Davy boy, is the name that you bear. Balfour of Shaws, an ancient, honest, reputable house, peradventure in these latter days decayed."
He gave me the letter, which was addressed in these words: "To the hands of Ebenezer Balfour, Esquire, of Shaws, in his House of Shaws, these will be delivered by my son, David Balfour." My heart was beating hard at this great prospect, now suddenly opening before a lad of 17 years of age, the son of a poor country dominie in the forest of Ettrick. "Mr. Campbell," I stammered, "if you were in my shoes, would you go?"
"Oh, of a surety," said the minister. "That would I, and without pause."
Here he cast about for a comfortable seat, lighted on a big boulder under a birch by the trackside, sat down upon it with a very long, serious upper lip, and the sun, now shining in upon us between two peaks, put his pocket handkerchief over his cocked hat to shelter him. There, then, with uplifted forefinger, he first put me on my guard against a considerable number of heresies to which I had no temptation, and urged upon me to be instant in my prayers and the reading of the Bible. That done, he drew a picture of the great house that I was bound to, and how I should conduct myself with its inhabitants.
Be supple, Davy, in things immaterial," said he. "Bear ye this in mind, that though gentle-born, you've had a country rearing. Dinna shame us, Davy. Dinna shame us in yon great muckle house with all these domestics, upper and under, show yourself as nice, as circumspect, as quick at the conception, and as slow of speech as any.
With that, he got upon his feet, took off his hat, and prayed a little while, aloud and in affecting terms for a young man setting out into the world. Then suddenly he took me in his arms and embraced me very hard. Then held me at arm's length, looking at me with his face all working with sorrow. And then, whipped about and crying goodbye to me, he set off backward by the way that we had come, at a sort of jogging run. What might have been laughable to another, but I was in no mind to laugh. I watched him as long as he was in sight, and he never stopped hurrying, nor once looked back. Then it came in upon my mind that this was all his sorrow at my departure, and my conscience smote me hard and fast, because I, for my part, was overjoyed to get away out of that quiet countryside and go to a great busy house among rich and respected gentlefolk of my own name and blood. On the forenoon of the second day, coming to the top of a hill, I saw all the country fall away before me, right down to the sea. And in the midst of this descent, on a long ridge, the city of Edinburgh smoking like a kiln. There was a flag upon the castle, and ships moving or lying anchored in the firth, both of which, for as far away as they were, I could distinguish clearly, and both brought my country heart into my mouth. Presently after, I came by a house where a shepherd lived, and I got a rough direction for the neighbourhood of Cramond, and so from one to another worked my way to the westward of the capital by Collington, till I came out upon the Glasgow road. And there, to my great pleasure and wonder, I beheld a regiment marching to the fifes, every foot in time. An old red-faced general on a grey horse at the one end, and at the other the company of grenadiers with their Pope's hats. The pride of life seemed to mount into my brain at the sight of the red coats and the hearing of that merry music. A little further on, and I was told I was in Cramond parish, and began to substitute in my inquiries the name of the House of Shaws. It was a word that seemed to surprise those of whom I sought my way. At first I thought the plainness of my appearance and my country habit, and that all dusty from the road, consorted ill with the greatness of the place to which I was bound. But after 2 or maybe 3 had given me the same look and the same answer, I began to take it in my head that there was something strange about the Shaws itself. It was drawing on to sundown when I met a stout, dark, sour-looking woman coming trudging down a hill. And she, when I'd put my usual question, turned sharp about, accompanied me back to the summit that she had just left, and pointed to a great bulk of buildings standing very bare upon a green in the bottom of the next valley.
"That is the House of Shaws," she cried. "Blood built it, and blood stopped the building of it, and blood shall bring it down. See here," she cried again. "I spit upon the ground, and I crack my thumb at it. Black be its fall. If you see the laird, tell him what you hear. Tell him this makes the 1219 time that Janet Clouston has called down the curse on him and his house, byre and stable, man, guest and master, wife, miss or bairn. Black be their fall."
The nearer I got to the house, the drearier it appeared. It seemed like the one wing of the house that had never been finished. What should have been the inner end stood open on the upper floors and showed against the sky with steps and stairs of uncompleted masonry. Many of the windows were unglazed, and bats flew in and out like doves out of a dovecot. The night had begun to fall as I got close, and in 3 of the lower windows, which were very high up and narrow and well barred, the changing light of a little fire began to glimmer. I came forward cautiously, and giving ear as I came, heard someone rattling with dishes, and a little dry, eager cough that came in fits. But there was no sound of speech, and not a dog barked. The door, as well as I could see it in the dim light, was a great piece of wood all studded with nails. And I lifted my hand with a faint heart under my jacket and knocked once. Then I stood and waited. The house had fallen into a dead silence. A whole minute passed away and nothing stirred but the bats overhead. I knocked again and hearkened again. But this time my ears had grown so accustomed to the quiet that I could hear the ticking of the clock inside as it slowly counted out the seconds. But whoever was in that house kept deadly still and must have held his breath. I was in two minds whether to run away, but anger got the upper hand, and I began instead to rain kicks and buffets on the door and to shout aloud for Mr. Balfour. I was in full career when I heard the cough right overhead, and jumping back and looking up, beheld a man's head in a tall nightcap and the bell mouth of a blunderbuss at one of the first-story windows.
"It's loaded,"
said a voice. "I've come here with a letter," I said, "to Mr. Ebenezer Balfour of Shaw's. Is he here?"
From whom is it?"
asked the man with the blunderbuss. "Well, that's neither here nor there," said I, for I was growing very wroth.
"Well,"
was the reply,
"you can put it down on the doorstep and be off with you."
"I will do no such thing," I cried. "I will deliver it into Mr. Balfour's hands as it was meant I should. It is a letter of introduction."
"A what?"
cried the voice sharply. I repeated what I had said.
Who are you yourself?"
was the next question after a considerable pause. "I'm not ashamed of my name," said I. "They call me David Balfour." At that I made sure the man started, for I heard the blunderbuss rattle on the windowsill. And it was after quite a long pause, and with a curious change of voice, that the next question followed.
"Is your father dead?"
I was so much surprised at this that I could find no voice to answer, but stood staring.
"Aye,"
the man resumed.
"He'll be dead, no doubt. And that'll be what brings you here chapping to my door."
Another pause, and then defiantly,
"Well, man," he said, "I'll let you in."
And he disappeared from the window. Presently there came a great rattling of chains and bolts, and the door was cautiously opened and shut to again behind me as soon as I had passed.
"Go into the kitchen and touch nothing,"
said the voice. And while the person of the house set himself to replacing the defences of the door, I groped my way forward and entered the kitchen. The fire had burned up fairly bright, and showed me the barest room I think I'd ever put my eyes on. Half a dozen dishes stood upon the shelves. The table was laid for supper with a bowl of porridge, a horn spoon, and a cup of small beer. And besides what I have named, there was not another thing in that great stone-vaulted empty chamber but lock-fast chests arranged along the wall and a corner cupboard with a padlock. As soon as the last chain was up, the man rejoined me. He was a mean, stooping, narrow-shouldered, clay-faced creature, and his age might have been anything between 50 and 70. His nightcap was of flannel, and so was the nightgown that he wore instead of coat and waistcoat over his ragged shirt. He was long unshaved, but what most distressed and even daunted me, he would neither take his eyes away from me, nor look me fairly in the face.
Are you sharp set?"
he asked, glancing about the level of my knee.
"You can eat that drop of parch."
I said I feared that it was his own supper.
"Oh," said he, "I can do fine wanting it. I'll take the ale, though, for it slockens my cough."
He drank the cup about half out, still keeping an eye upon me as he drank, and then suddenly held out his hand.
Let's see the letter."
I told him the letter was for Mr. Balfour, not for him.
"And who do you think I am?"
says he.
"Come on, give me Alexander's letter."
"You know my father's name?"
"It'd be strange if I didn't,"
he returned.
for he was my born brother. And little as you seem to like either me or my house or my good parrots, I'm your born uncle, Davy, my man, and you my born nephew. So come on, give us the letter, and sit you down and fill your kite.
If I'd been some years younger, what with shame, weariness, and disappointment, I believe I'd burst into tears. As it was, I could find no words, neither black nor white, but handed him the letter and sat down to the porridge with as little appetite for meat as ever a young man had. Meanwhile, my uncle, stooping over the fire, turned the letter over and over in his hands.
Do you ken what's in it?
He asked. Well, you see for yourself, sir, said I, that the seal has not been broken.
Aye,
said he.
But what brought you here?
Well, to give the letter, said I.
No, says he cunningly. But you'll have had some hopes, no doubt.
I confess, sir, said I, that when I was told that I had kinsfolk well-to-do, I did indeed indulge the hope that they might help me in my life. But I'm no beggar. I look for no favors at your hands, and I want none that are not freely given. For as poor as I appear, I have friends of my own that will blithe to help me.
Hoot,
said Uncle Ebenezer.
Dinna fly up and snuff at me. We'll agree fine yet. And Davy, my man, if you're done with that bit porridge, I could just take a sup of it myself.
Aye, he continued, as soon as he'd ousted me from the stool and the spoon.
They're fine, wholesome food. They're grand food, porridge.
He murmured a little grace to himself and fell to.
Your father's been long dead?
He asked. 3 weeks, sir, said I.
He was a secret man, Alexander. A silent, secret man, he continued. He never said muckle when he was young. He'll never have spoken muckle of me.
I never knew, sir, till you told it to me yourself, that he had any brothers.
Oh, dear me. Oh, dear me, said Ebenezer. Nor yet of Shores, I dare say.
Not so much as the name, sir, said I.
Oh, do you think of that? Oh, do you think of that? A strange nature of a man.
For all that, he seemed singularly satisfied. But whether with himself or me, or with this conduct of my father's, was more than I could read. Certainly, however, he seemed to be outgrowing that distaste or ill will that he'd conceived at first against my person. For presently he jumped up, came across the room behind me, and hit me a smack upon the shoulder.
We'll agree fine yet, he cried. Or I'm just as glad I let you in. And now, come aboard to your bed.
To my surprise, he lit no lamp or candle, but set forth into the dark passage, groped his way, breathing deeply, up a flight of steps, and paused before a door which he unlocked. I was close upon his heels, having stumbled after him as best I might. And then he bade me go in, for this was my chamber. I did as he bid, but paused after a few steps and begged a light to go to bed with.
Oh, hoot, said Uncle Ebenezer. There's a fine moon.
Neither moon nor stars, sir. And dark as the pit, said I. I can't see the bed.
Hoot, said he. Lights in the house is a thing I dinna agree with. I'm on co-feared the fires. Good night to you, Davy, my man.
Before I had time to add further protest, he pulled the door to, and I heard him lock me in from the outside. I did not know whether to laugh or cry. The room was as cold as a well, and the bed, when I found my way to it, as damp as a peat hag. But by good fortune, I'd caught up my bundle and my plan. Rolling myself in the latter, I lay down upon the floor underneath the big bedspread and fell speedily asleep. The next day passed fairly well. We had hot porridge at breakfast, porridge cold again at noon, and hot porridge at night. Porridge and small beer was my uncle's diet. In a room next door to the kitchen, where he suffered me to go, I found a great number of books, both Latin and English, in which I took great pleasure all the afternoon. One thing I discovered, which put me in some doubt. This was an entry on the fly-leaf of a chapbook, plainly written by my father's hand and thus conceived. To my brother Ebenezer, on his 5th birthday. Now, what puzzled me was this. That as my father was, of course, the younger brother, he must either have made some strange error, or he must have written, before he was yet 5, an excellent, clear, manly hand of writing. I tried to get this out of my head. But though I took down many interesting authors, old and new, history, poetry, and storybook, this notion of my father's hand of writing stuck to me. And when at length I went back into the kitchen and sat down once more to porridge and small beer, the first thing I said to Uncle Ebenezer was to ask him if my father had not been very quick at his book.
Alexander. I know him, was the reply. Oh, no, I was far quicker myself. Oh, I was a clever chappie when I was young. Why, I could read as soon as he could.
Well, this puzzled me yet more. And a thought coming into my head, I asked if he and my father had been twins. He jumped upon his stool, and the horn spoon fell out of his hand and upon the floor.
What dares ye to ask that?
He said. And he caught me by the breast of the jacket and looked this time straight into my eyes. His own were little and light and bright like a bird's, blinking and winking strangely. What do you mean? I asked very calmly, for I was far stronger than he and not easily frightened. Take your hand from my jacket. This is no way to behave. My uncle seemed to be making a great effort upon himself.
Dod man, David, he said. You shouldn't speak to me about your father. That's where the mistake is.
He sat a while and shook, blinking in his plate.
He was all the brother that ever I had,
he added, but with no heart in his voice. And then he caught up his spoon and fell to supper again, but still shaking. Now this last passage, this laying of hands upon my person and sudden profession of love for my dead father, went so clean beyond my comprehension that it put me both into fear and hope. On the one hand, I began to think my uncle was perhaps insane and might be dangerous. On the other, there came into my mind, quite unbidden by me and even discouraged, a story like some ballad I had heard folks singing of a poor lad that was a rightful heir and a wicked kinsman that tried to keep him from his own. For why should my uncle play a part with a relative that came almost a beggar to the door, unless in his heart he had some cause to fear him?
Davy,
he said at length.
Davy, I've been thinking.
He pulled out of his pocket a rusty key.
There, says he. There is the key of the stair tower at the far end of the house. You can only win into it from the outside, for that part of the house is no finished, you see. Now, gang in there and up the stairs, and bring me down the chest that's at the top. There's papers in it, he added.
Well, can I have a light, sir? Said I.
Ernie, he said very cunningly. No, no lights in my house.
Oh, very well, sir, said I. Are the stairs good?
Oh, they're grand, said he.
And then as I was going,
keep to the wall, though. There is no banisters. But the stairs are grand underfoot.
Out I went into the night. The wind was still moaning in the distance, though never a breath of it came near to the House of Shores. It had fallen blacker than ever, and I was glad to feel along the wall till I came to the length of the stair-towered door at the far end of the unfinished wing. I'd got the key into the keyhole and had just turned it when all upon a sudden, without sound of wind or thunder, the whole sky lighted up with wild fire and went black again. I had to put my hand over my eyes to get back to the color of the darkness. And indeed, I was already half blinded when I stepped into the tower. It was so dark inside, it seemed a body could scarce breathe. But I pushed out with foot and hand, and presently struck the wall with the one, and the lowermost round of the stair with the other. The house of Shaw stood some 5 full stories high, not counting lofts. Well, as I advanced, it seemed to me that the stair grew airier and a thought more lightsome, and I was wondering what might be the cause of this change, when a second blink of the summer lightning came and went. If I did not cry out, it was because fear had me by the throat, and if I did not fall, it was more by heaven's mercy than my own strength. It was not only that the flash shone in on every side through breaches in the wall, so that I seemed to be clambering aloft upon an open scaffold, but the same passing brightness showed me the steps were of unequal length, and that one of my feet rested that moment within 2 inches of the well. So this was the grand stair, I thought. And with the thought, a gust of a kind of angry courage came into my heart. My uncle had sent me here, certainly to run great risks, perhaps to die. I swore I would settle that perhaps if I should break my neck for it. Got me down upon my hands and knees, and as slowly as a snail, feeling before me every inch and testing the solidity of every stone, I continued to ascend the stair. The darkness, by contrast to the flash, appeared to have redoubled, nor was that all, for my ears were now troubled and my mind confounded by a great stir of bats in the top part of the tower, and the foul beasts flying downward sometimes beat about my face and body. The tower, I should have said, was square, and in every corner the step was made of a great stone of a different shape to join the flights. Well, I had come close to one of these turns when, feeling forward as usual, my hand slipped upon an edge and found nothing but emptiness beyond it. The stair had been carried no higher. To set a stranger mounting it in the darkness was to send him straight to his death. And although, thanks to the lightning and my own precautions, I was safe enough, the mere thought of the peril in which I might have stood and the dreadful height I might have fallen from brought out the sweat upon my body and relaxed my joints. But I knew what I wanted now, and I turned and groped my way down again with a wonderful anger in my heart. About halfway down, the wind sprang up in a clap and shook the tower and died again. The rain followed, and before I'd reached the ground level, it fell in buckets. I put out my head into the storm and looked along towards the kitchen. The door, which I'd shut behind me when I left, now stood open and shed a little glimmer of light. And I thought I could see a figure standing in the rain, quite still, like a man hearkening. And then there came a blinding flash, which showed me my uncle plainly just where I had fancied him to stand. And hard upon the heels of it, a great clap of thunder. Now, whether my uncle thought the crash to be the sound of my fall, or whether he heard it in God's voice denouncing murder, I will leave you to guess. Certain it is, at least, that he was seized on by a kind of panic fear, and that he ran into the house and left the door open behind him. I followed as softly as I could, and coming unheard into the kitchen, stood and watched him. He had found time to open the corner cupboard and bring out a great case bottle of aquavita, and now sat with his back towards me at the table. Ever and again he would be seized with a fit of deadly shuddering, and groan aloud, and carrying the bottle to his lips, drank down the raw spirits by the mouthful. I stepped forward, came close behind him where he sat, and suddenly clapping my 2 hands down upon his shoulders, I cried, "Ah!" My uncle gave a kind of broken cry like a sheep's bleat, flung up his arms, and tumbled to the floor like a dead man. I was somewhat shocked at this, but I had myself to look to first of all, and did not hesitate to let him lie as he had fallen. The keys were hanging in the cupboard, and it was my design to furnish myself with arms before my uncle should come again to his senses and the power of devising evil. In the cupboard were a few bottles, some apparently of medicine, a great many bills and other papers, which I should willingly enough have rummaged, had I the time, and a few necessaries that were nothing to my purpose. Thence I turned to the chests. The first was full of meal, the second of money bags and papers tied into sheaves, and in the third, with many other things, and these for the most part clothes, I found a rusty, ugly-looking Highland dirk without the scabbard. This then I concealed inside my waistcoat, and turned to my uncle. He lay as he had fallen, all huddled, with one knee up and one arm sprawling abroad. His face had a strange color of blue, and he seemed to have ceased breathing. Fear came upon me that he was dead. And then I got water and dashed it in his face. And with that he seemed to come to a little, working his mouth and fluttering his eyelids. At last, he looked up and saw me. And there came into his eyes a terror that was not of this world. Come, come, said I. Sit up.
Harry, Harry, are you alive? Are you alive?
He sobbed.
Oh, mine, are you alive?
That I am, I said. Small thanks to you. He'd begun to seek for his breath with deep sighs.
The file. The blue file, Davy. The file, said he. In the ombre. The blue file, Davy.
His breath came slower still. I ran to the cupboard and sure enough found there a blue phial of medicine with the dose written on it on a paper. And this I administered to him with what speed I might.
It's the trouble, Davy. It's the trouble,
he said, reviving a little.
Our trouble, Davy. It's a heart. It's a heart.
I sat him on a chair and looked at him. It's true, I felt some pity for a man that looked so sick. But I was full besides of righteous anger, and I numbered over before him the points on which I wanted explanation. Why he lied to me, why he disliked it to be hinted that he and my father were twins, and why he had tried to kill me. He heard me all through in silence, and then, in a broken voice, begged me to let him go to bed.
Davy, I'll tell you in the morning. I'll tell you in the morning. As sure as death I will.
And so weak was he that I could do nothing but consent. I locked him into his room, however, and pocketed the key. And then, returning to the kitchen, made up such a blaze as had not been shone there for many a long year. And wrapping myself in my plaid, lay down upon the chest and fell asleep.
The next morning, before David can force an explanation from his uncle, a messenger arrives from the port of Queensferry. Uncle Ebenezer explains that he's in business with the skipper of a trading ship, the Covenant, and that he must go immediately to see him. He promises David that as soon as he's completed his business, he'll take him to the family lawyer, where all will be explained. So David goes to Queensferry, and once there, he's easily persuaded to go on board the ship. David is then seized, knocked unconscious, and when he comes round, he finds the ship is already at sea, bound for America. The skipper is a rough and brutal man, Captain Hoseason. He makes David the cabin boy, with the job of looking after the ship's officers in their quarters in the roundhouse. Once past the north of Scotland, the Covenant meets heavy storms and is driven south along the rocky west coast. There, she runs down a small boat in the fog, and they manage to pick up only one survivor, a small, sprightly man called Alan Breck. Breck is a Jacobite, a supporter of the cause of Bonnie Prince Charlie. He has been visiting his clansmen in the Appin area and was on his way back to France. Now, however, he agrees to pay Captain Hoseason 60 guineas to be set ashore in the Highlands again. Soon after this, though, David hears the captain and his officers plotting to kill Alan Breck. He goes back to the roundhouse and warns Breck of the plot, and together they prepare to defend themselves against the ship's crew.
dirk which he held in his left hand in case they should run in under his sword. I, on my part, clambered up into the berth with an armful of pistols and something of a heavy heart, and set open the window where I was to watch. It was a small part of the deck that I could overlook, but enough for our purpose. I tried to pray, I remember. But that same hurry of my mind, like a man running, would not suffer me to think upon the words. And my chief wish was to have the thing begin and be done with. It came all of a sudden when it did, with a rush of feet and a roar, and then a shout from Alan, and a sound of blows and someone crying out as if hurt. I looked back over my shoulder and saw Mr. Schuern in the doorway crossing blades with Alan. "Look to your window," said Alan, and as I turned back to my place, I saw him pass his sword through the mate's body. It was none too soon for me to look to my own part, for my head was scarce back at the window before 5 men, carrying a spare yard for a battering ram, ran past me and took post to drive the door in. I'd never fired with a pistol in my life, and not often with a gun, far less against a fellow creature. But it was now or never, and just as they swang the yard, I cried out, "Take that!" and I shot into their midst. Well, I must have hit one of them, for he sang out and gave back a step, and the rest stopped as if a little disconcerted. Before they had time to recover, I sent another ball over their heads, and my third shot, which went as wide as the second, the whole party threw down the yard and ran for it. Then I looked round again into the deck house. The whole place was full of the smoke of my own firing, just as my ears seemed to be burst from the noise of the shots. But there was Alan standing as before, only now his sword was running blood to the hilt, and himself so swelled with triumph and fallen into so fine an attitude that he looked to be invincible. Right before him on the floor was Mr. Schuern, on his hands and knees. The blood was pouring from his mouth, and he was sinking slowly, lower, with a terrible white face. And just as I looked, some of those from behind caught hold of him by the heels and dragged him bodily out of the roundhouse. I believe he died as they were doing it. "There is one of your wigs for you," cried Alan. And then, turning to me, he asked if I'd done much execution. I told him that I'd winged one and thought it was the captain. "Aye, and I've settled 2, says he. "No, there's not enough blood left. They'll be back again. To your watch, David. This was but a dram before meat." By this, my pistols were ready, and there was nothing to do but listen and wait. While the brush lasted, I'd not the time to think if I was frightened. But now, when all was still again, my mind ran upon nothing else. The thought of the sharp swords and the cold steel was strong in me. And presently, when I began to hear stealthy steps and a brushing of man's clothes against the roundhouse wall, and knew they were taking their places in the dark, I could have found it in my mind to cry out aloud. All this was upon Alan's side, and I'd begun to think my share of the fight was at an end, when I heard someone drop softly onto the roof above me. Then there came a single call on the sea-pipe, and that was the signal. A knot of them made one rush of it, cutlass in hand, against the door. And at the same moment, the glass of the skylight was dashed into 1,000 pieces, and a man leapt through and landed on the floor. Before he got to his feet, I clapped a pistol at his back and might have shot him too, only at the touch of him, and him alive, my whole flesh misgave me, and I could no more pull the trigger than I could have flown. He had dropped his cutlass as he jumped, and when he felt the pistol, whipped straight round and laid hold of me, roaring out an oath. And at that either my courage came again, or I grew so much afraid as he came to the same thing, for I gave a shriek and shot him in the midst of the body. He gave the most horrible, ugly groan and fell to the floor. The foot of a second fellow, whose legs were dangling through the skylight, struck me at the same time upon the head. And at that I snatched another pistol and shot this one through the thigh, so that he slipped through and tumbled in a lump on his companion's body. There was no talk of missing any more than there was time to aim, for I clapped the muzzle to the very place and fired. I might have stood and stared at them for long, but I heard Alan shout as if for help, and that brought me to my senses. He had kept the door so long, but one of the seamen, while he was engaged with others, had run in under his guard and caught him about the... Alan was dirking him with his left hand, but the fellow clung like a leech. Another had broken in and had his cutlass raised. The door was thronged with their faces, and I thought we were lost, and catching up my cutlass, I fell on them in flank. But I had not time to be of help. The wrestler dropped at last, and Alan, leaping back to get his distance, ran upon the others like a bull, roaring as he went. They broke before him like water, turning and running and falling one against the other in their haste. The sword in his hands flashed like quicksilver into the huddle of our fleeing enemies, and at every flash there came the scream of a man hurt. I was still thinking we were lost, when lo, they were all gone, and Alan was driving them along the deck as a sheepdog chases sheep. Yet he was no sooner out than he was back again, being as cautious as he was brave. And meanwhile the seaman continued running and crying out as if he was still behind them, and we heard them tumble one upon the other into the forecastle and clap to the hatch upon the top. The round house was like a shambles. 3 were dead inside, another lay in his death agony across the threshold, and there were Alan and I, victorious and unhurt. He came up to me with open arms, and embraced and kissed me hard upon both cheeks. "Davy," he said, "I love you like a brother. And oh, man," he cried in a kind of ecstasy, "am I no a bonny fighter?"
After their victory in the siege of the Round House, Alan Breck tells David about his life, how he acts as a messenger between the exiled chief of the clan and the people of Appin in the Western Highlands, and how his clansmen are now hounded and harried by the king's agent in the area, Colin Campbell, who's known as the Red Fox of Glenure. Soon after this, in the storm, the ship is wrecked. David is thrown overboard as the ship runs aground, but he manages to struggle ashore on the island of Mull. He finds himself alone, but in the hope of meeting Alan Breck again, he crosses the island and gets a fishing boat to carry him over to the mainland, where he plans to make for Ochan, the headquarters of Alan's clan. It's also the home of James of the Glens, the man who now represents the exiled chief.
It was near noon before we set out. A dark day with clouds and the sun shining upon little patches. The sea was here very deep and still, but had scarce a wave upon it, so that I must put the water to my lips before I could believe it to be truly salt. The mountains on either side were high, rough and barren, very black and gloomy in the shadow of the clouds, but all silver-laced with little watercourses where the sun shone upon them. It seemed a hard country, this of Appin, for people to care as much about as Alan did. There was but one thing to mention. A little after we had started, the sun shone upon a little moving clump of scarlet, close in along the waterside to the north. It was much of the same red as soldiers' coats, and every now and then, too, there came little sparks and lightnings as though the sun had struck upon bright steel. I asked my boatman what it should be, and he answered that he supposed it was some of the red soldiers coming from Fort William into Appin against the poor tenantry of the country. At last we came so near the point of land at the entering in of Loch Leven that I begged to be set ashore. This was a wood of birches growing on a steep, craggy side of a mountain that overhung the loch. It had many openings, and a road or bridle track ran north and south through the midst of it. Here I was not only troubled by a cloud of stinging midges, but far more by the doubts of my mind. What I ought to do, why I was going to join myself with an outlaw and a would-be murderer like Alan, or whether I should not be acting more like a man of sense to tramp back to the south country direct. As I was so sitting and thinking, a sound of men and horses came to me through the wood. And presently after, at a turning of the road, I saw 4 travellers come into view. The way was in this part so rough and narrow that they came single and led their horses by the reins. The first, a great red-headed gentleman of an imperious and flushed face, who carried his hat in his hand and fanned himself, for he was in a breathing heat. The second, by his decent black garb and white wig, I correctly took to be a lawyer. The third was a servant, and wore some part of his clothes in tartan, which showed that his master was of a Highland family, and either an outlaw or else in singular good odour with the government, since the wearing of tartan was against the act. If I'd been better versed in these things, I would have known that the tartan to be of the Argyle or Campbell colours. As for the fourth, who brought up the tale, I'd seen his like before, and knew him at once to be a sheriff's officer. I had no sooner seen these people coming than I made up my mind, for no reason that I could tell, to go through with my adventure. And when the first came alongside of me, I rose up from the bracken and asked the way to O'Han. He stopped and looked at me, as I thought, a little oddly. And then turning to the lawyer,
"Mungo," said he, "there's many a man would think this a warning. Here am I on my road to Duror on the job you ken, and here is a young lad starts up out of the bracken and speers if I'm on my way to O'Han."
"Glenure," said the other, "this is an ill subject for jesting." These two had now drawn close up and were gazing at me, while the 2 followers had halted about the stone cast in the rear.
"And what's Hiki in O'Han?"
said Colin Roy Campbell of Glenure, him they called the Red Fox, for he it was that I had stopped. "The man that lives there," said I.
"James of the Glens,"
says Glenure musingly, and then to the lawyer,
"Is he gathering his people, think ye?"
"Anyway," says the lawyer, "we shall do better to bide where we are and let the soldiers rally us." "If you're concerned for me," said I am neither of his people nor yours, but an honest subject of King George, owing no man and fearing no man."
"Why, very well said. But if I may make so bold as to ask, what does this honest man so far from his country? And why does he come seeking the brother of our chiel? I have power here, I must tell you. I am king's factor upon several of these estates and have 12 files of soldiers at my back."
"Well, I've heard a waif word in the country," said I, and a little nettled, "that you were a hard man to drive." He still kept looking at me as if in doubt.
"Well," said he at last, "your tongue is bold, but I am no unfriend to plainness. If ye had asked me the way to the door of James Stewart on any other day but this, I would have set ye right and bidden ye Godspeed. But today, Mungo?"
And he turned again to look at the lawyer. But just as he turned, there came the shot of a firelock from higher up the hill. And with the very sound of it, Glenure fell upon the road.
Oh, I'm dead. I'm dead. Oh, I'm dead,"
cried several times over. The lawyer had caught him up and held him in his arms, the servant standing over and clasping his hands. And now the wounded man looked from one to another with scared eyes. And there was a change in his voice that went to the heart. "Take care of yourselves. Take care of yourselves," he said. "I'm dead." He tried to open his clothes as if to look for the wound, but his fingers slipped on the button. And with that he gave a great sigh. His head rolled on his shoulder, and he passed away. The lawyer never said a word, but his face was as sharp as a pen and as white as the dead man's. The servant broke out into a great noise of crying and weeping like a child, and I, on my side, stood staring at them in a kind of horror. The sheriff's officer had run back at the first sound of the shot to hasten the coming of the soldiers. At last the lawyer laid down the dead man in his blood upon the road and got to his feet with a kind of stagger. I believe it was his movement that brought me to my senses. He had no sooner done so than I began to scramble up the hill, crying out, "The murderer! The murderer!" So little a time had elapsed, when I got to the top of the first steepness, could see some part of the open mountain, the murderer was still moving away at no great distance. He was a big man in a black coat with metal buttons and carried a long fowling piece. "Here!" I cried. "I see him!" At that, the murderer gave a little quick look over his shoulder and began to run. And the next moment he was lost in a fringe of birches. And then he came out again onto the upper side, where I could see him climbing like a jackanapes, for that part again was very steep. And then he dipped behind a shoulder, and I saw him no more. All this time I had been running on my side, and had got a good way up when a voice cried upon me to stand. I was at the edge of the upper wood, and so now, when I halted and looked back, I saw all the open part of the hill below me. The lawyer and the sheriff's officer were standing just above the road, crying and waving on to me to come back. And on their left, the redcoats, musket in hand, were beginning to struggle singly out of the lower wood. "Why should I come back?" I cried. "Come you on."
"There's £10 if you take that lad,"
cried the lawyer.
"He's an accomplice. He was posted here to hold us and talk."
At that word, which I could hear quite plainly, though it was to the soldiers and not to me that he was crying it, my heart came in my mouth with quite a new kind of terror. Indeed, it is one thing to stand the danger of your life, and quite another to run the peril of both life and character. The thing besides had come so suddenly, like thunder out of a clear sky, that I was all amazed and helpless. The soldiers began to spread, some of them to run, and others to put up their pieces and cover me. And still I stood. "In here, among the trees," said a voice close by. Indeed, I scarce knew what I was doing, but I obeyed. And as I did so, I heard the firelocks bang and the balls whistle in the birches. Just inside the shelter of the trees, I found Alan Breck standing with a fishing rod. He gave me no salutation. Indeed, it was no time for civilities. Only, "Come," says he, and set off running along the side of the mountain towards Ballacoolish. And I, like a sheep, to follow him. Now we ran among the birches, now stooping behind low humps upon the mountainside, now crawling on all fours among the heather. The pace was deadly. My heart seemed bursting against my ribs, and I'd neither time to think nor breath to speak with. Only I remember seeing with wonder that Alan, every now and then, would straighten himself to his full height and look back, and every time that he did so, there came a great faraway cheering and crying of the soldiers. A quarter of an hour later, Alan stopped, clapped down flat in the heather, and turned to me. "Now," said he, "it's earnest. Do as I do for your life." At the same speed, but now with infinitely more precaution, we traced back again across the mountainside by the same way that we'd come, only perhaps higher, till at last Alan threw himself down in the upper wood of Lettermore, where I'd found him at the first, and lay with his face in the bracken, panting like a dog. My own side so ached, my head swam, my tongue so hung out of my mouth with heat and dryness, that I lay beside him like one dead.
Alan tells David it was not him who fired the shot that killed the Red Fox, but he admits that he had deliberately led the soldiers away from the killer.
Then he grew very grave and said we had not much time to throw away, but must both flee that country. He, because he was a deserter, and the whole of Appin would now be searched like a chamber, and everyone obliged to give a good account of himself, and I, because I was certainly involved in the murder. "Oh," says I, willing to give him a little lesson, "I have no fear of the justice of my country." "As if this was your country," said he, "or as if ye would be tried here in a country of Stuarts." "It's all Scotland," said I. "Man, a whiles wonder at ye," said Alan. "This is a Campbell that's been killed. Well, it'll be tried in Inverera, the Campbell's head place, with 15 Campbells in the jury box, and the biggest Campbell of all, and that's the Duke, sitting cocking on the bench. Justice, David. The same justice by all the world as Glenure found a while ago at the roadside." This frightened me a little, I confess. Still, I cried out that he was unjust to the Duke of Argyll, who, for all he was a Whig, was yet a wise and honest gentleman. "Our hoot," said Alan. "The man's a Whig, no doubt, but I would never deny that he was a good chieftain to his clan."
And what would the clan think if there was a Campbell shot and nobody hanged? And their own chief, the Justice General? But I've often observed, says Alan, that you low country bodies have no clear idea of what's right and wrong. Nah, he said, we're in the Highlands, David. And when I tell you to run, take my word and run. No doubt it's a hard thing to skulk and starve in the heather, but it's harder yet to lie shackled in a redcoat prison. I asked him whether we should flee. And as he told me, to the lowlands, I was a little better inclined to go with him. But indeed, I was growing impatient to get back and have the upper hand of my uncle. I'll chance it, Alan, said I. I'll go with you. But mind you, said Alan, it's no small thing. You mun lie bare and hard and broke many an empty belly. Your bed shall be the moorcocks, and your life shall be like the hunted deers, and you shall sleep with your hand upon your weapons. Aye, man. You shall teggle many a weary foot or you get clear. I tell you this at the start, for it's a life that I ken well. But if you ask what other chance you have, I answer none. Either take to the heather with me, or else hang. And that's a choice very easily made, said I. And we shook hands upon it.
They have a long, arduous journey through the mountains, with the soldiers searching for them everywhere. They travel at night, but one morning, the approach of dawn finds them in Glencoe, a deep valley strewn with great rocks, but with no trees for cover.
The first peep of morning showed us this horrible place, and I could see Alan knit his brow.
Oh, this is no fit place for you or me, he said. This is a place they're bound to watch.
And with that, he ran harder than ever down to the waterside, in a part where the river was split in two among 3 rocks. It went through with a horrid thundering that made my belly quake, and there hung over the linn a little mist of spray. Alan looked neither to the right nor to the left, but jumped clean upon the middle rock and fell there on his hands and knees to check himself. But that rock was small, and he might have pitched over on the far side. I'd scarce time to measure the distance or to understand the peril before I had followed him, and he had caught and stopped me. So there we stood, side by side upon a small rock slippery with spray, a far broader leap in front of us and the river dinning upon all sides. And when I saw where I was, there came on me a deadly sickness of fear, and I put my hand over my eyes. Alan took me and shook me. I saw he was speaking, but the roaring of the falls and the trouble of my mind prevented me from hearing. Only I saw his face was red with anger, and that he stamped upon the rock. The same look showed me the water raging by, and the mist hanging in the air. And with that, I covered my eyes again and shuddered. The next minute, Alan had set the brandy bottle to my lips and forced me to drink about a gill, which sent the blood into my head again. Then, putting his hands to his mouth and his mouth to my ear, he shouted, "Hang or drown!" And turning his back upon me, leapt over the farther branch of the stream and landed safe. I was now alone upon the rock, which gave me the more room. The brandy was singing in my ears. I had this good example fresh before me, and just wit enough to see that if I did not leap at once, I should never leap at all. I bent low on my knees and flung myself forth with that kind of anger of despair that has sometimes stood me instead of courage. Sure enough, it was but my hands that reached the full length. These slipped, caught again, slipped again, and I was slithering back into the linn when Alan seized me, first by the hair, then by the collar, and with a great strain dragged me into safety. Never a word he said, but set off running again for his life, and I must stagger to my feet and run after him. I'd been weary before, but now I was sick and bruised and partly drunken with the brandy. I kept stumbling as I ran. I had a stitch that came near to overmaster me. And when at last Alan paused under a great rock that stood there among a number of others, it was none too soon for David Balfour. A great rock, I've said. At my right, it was 2 rocks leaning together at the top, both some 20 feet high and at first sight inaccessible. Even Alan failed twice in an attempt to climb them, And it was only at the third trial, and then by standing on my shoulders and leaping up with such force as I must have broken my collarbone, that he secured a lodgment. Once there, he let down his leathern girdle, and with the aid of that and a pair of shallow footholds in the rock, I scrambled up beside him. Then I saw why we had come there. For the two rocks, being both somewhat hollow on the top and sloping one to the other, made a kind of dish or saucer, where as many as 3 or 4 men might have lain hidden. The dawn had come quite clear. We could see the stony sides of the valley and its bottom, which was bestrewed with rocks, and the river which went from one side to another and made white falls. But nowhere the smoke of a house, nor any living creature, but some eagles screaming round a cliff. Then, at last, Alan smiled.
Aye, said he. Now we have a chance.
And then, looking at me with some amusement,
You're no very clegg at the jumping,
said he. At this, I suppose, I coloured with mortification, for he added at once,
Hoot, small blame to you. Or to be feared of a thing and yet to do it is what makes the prettiest kind of a man. And then there was water there, and what is a thing that dauntens even me? No, no, said Alan. It's no you that's to blame, it's me.
I asked him why.
Why, said he? Oh, I'll prove myself a gummerel this night. But first of all, I take a wrong road, and that in my own country of Appin, so that the day has caught us where we should never have been. And thanks to that, we lie here in some danger and mere discomfort. And next, which is the worst of the two for a man that is so much about the heather as myself, I've come wanting a water bottle, and here we lie for a long summer's day with nothing but neat spirit. Or you may think it a small matter. Before it becomes night, David, you'll give me news of it.
I was anxious to redeem my character, and offered, if he would pour out the brandy, to run down and fill the bottle at the river.
I wouldn't have wasted a good spirit either, said he. It's been a good friend to you this night. Or, in my poor opinion, you would still be cocking on your stone. And what's more, says he, you may have observed, you that's a man of so much penetration, that Alan Breck Stewart was perhaps walking quicker than is ordinary.
You, I cried. You were running fit to burst.
Or was I so, said he. Well, then, you may depend upon it, there was nae time to be lost. And now here is enough said. Gang you to your sleep, lad, and I'll watch.
Accordingly, I lay down to sleep. A little peaty earth had drifted in between the top of the two rocks, and some bracken grew there to be a bed to me. The last thing I heard was still the crying of the eagles. I dare say it would be 9 in the morning when I was roughly awakened and found Alan's hand pressed upon my mouth.
Whisht, he said. He was snoring.
Well, said I, surprised at his anxious and dark face. And why not? He peered over the edge of the rock and signed to me to do the like. It was now high day, cloudless and very hot. The valley was as clear as in a picture. About half a mile up the water was a camp of redcoats. A big fire blazed in their midst, of which some were cooking. And nearby, on the top of a rock about as high as ours, there stood a sentry with the sun sparkling on his arms. All the way down along the riverside were posted other sentries. Here, near together, there, widelier scattered, some planted like the first on places of command, some on the ground level and marching and counter-marching so as to meet halfway. Higher up the glen, where the ground was more open, the chain of posts was continued by horse soldiers, whom we could just see in the distance riding to and fro. I took but one look at them, and ducked again into my place. It was strange indeed to see this valley, which had lain so solitary in the hour of dawn, bristling with arms and dotted with the redcoats and breeches.
You see, said Alan, this was what I was afraid of, Davy, that they should watch the barnside. They began to come in here about 2 hours ago, and man, oh, but you're a grand hand at the sleeping. We're in a narrow place here. If they get up the sides of the hill, they could easily spy us with a glass. But if they'll only keep in the foot of the valley, we'll do yet. The posts are thinner down the water, and come night, we'll try our hand at getting by them.
And what are we to do until night, I asked.
Lie here, he said, and bristle.
That one good Scotch word, bristle, was indeed most of the story of the day that we had now to pass. You were to remember that we lay on the bare top of a rock like scones upon a girdle. The sun beat upon us cruelly, and the rock grew so heated a man could scarcely endure the touch of it. And the little patch of earth and fern which kept cooler was only large enough for one at a time. We took turnabout to lie on the naked rock, which was indeed like the position of that saint that was martyred on a gridiron. And it ran in my mind how strange it was that in the same climate, and at only a few days' distance, I should have suffered so cruelly, first from cold upon my island, and now from heat upon this rock. All the while we had no water, only raw brandy for a drink, which was worse than nothing. But we kept the bottle as cool as we could, burying it in the earth, and got some relief by bathing our breasts and temples. The soldiers kept stirring all day in the bottom of the valley, now changing guard, now in patrolling parties, hunting among the rocks. These lay round in so great a number that to look for men among them was like looking for a needle in a bottle of hay. And being so hopeless a task, it was gone about with the less care. Yet we could see the soldiers pike their bayonets among the heather, which sent a cold thrill into my vitals. And they would sometimes hang about our rock, so that we scarce dared to breathe. At last, about 2, it was beyond men's bearing, and there was now temptation to resist as well as pain to bear. For the sun, being now a little into the west, there came a patch of shade on the east side of our rock, which was the side sheltered from the soldiers.
As well one death as another, said Alan,
and slipped over the edge and dropped on the ground on the shadowy side. I followed him at once, and instantly fell all my length, so weak was I and so giddy with that long exposure. Here then we lay for an hour or two, aching from head to foot, as weak as water, and lying quite naked to the eye of any soldier who should have strolled that way. None came, however, all passing by on the other side, so that our rock continued to be our shield, even in this new position. Presently we began to get a little strength, and as the soldiers were now lying closer along the riverside, Alan proposed that we should try a start. I was by this time afraid of but one thing in the world, and that was to be set back upon the rock. Anything else was welcome to me. So we got ourselves at once in marching order, and began to slip from rock to rock, one after the other, now crawling flat on our bellies in the shade, now making a run for it, heart in mouth. The soldier, having searched this side of the valley after a fashion, and being perhaps somewhat sleepy with the sultriness of the afternoon, had now laid by much of their vigilance, and stood dozing at their posts, or only kept a lookout along the banks of the river, so that in this way, keeping down the valley and at the same time towards the mountain, we drew steadily away from their neighborhood. But the business was the most wearing I had ever taken part in. A man had need of 100 eyes in every part of him to keep concealed in that uneven country, within cry of so many and scattered sentries. When we must pass an open place, quickness was not all, but a swift judgment not only of the lie of the whole country, but of the solidity of every stone on which we must set foot. For the afternoon was now fallen so breathless that the rolling of a pebble sounded abroad like a pistol shot, and would start the echo calling among the hills and cliffs. By sundown we had made some distance, even by our slow rate of progress, though to be sure the sentry on the rock was still plainly in our view. But now we came on something that put all fears out of season, and that was a deep, rushing burn that tore down in that part to join the Glen River. At the sight of this, we cast ourselves on the ground and plunged head and shoulders in the water, and I cannot tell which was the more pleasant, the great shock as the cool stream went over us, or the greed with which we drank of it.
After many more adventures, the two friends reach the lowlands, cross the Forth, and find themselves at Queensferry, the place where David was kidnapped. Here, David seeks out the old family lawyer, Mr. Rankila, and discovers what he suspected, that his uncle Ebenezer had cheated his father out of the family estate and had tried to cheat him too of his rightful inheritance. Together, David and the lawyer devise a plan to incriminate the old man beyond all possible doubt. So once again, David finds himself heading for the House of Shaws, this time, though, with the lawyer's clerk Torrance, and Alan Breck to help them. The canny lawyer, by the way, insists on referring to Alan always as Mr. Thompson, to avoid having to recognize an acknowledged outlaw.
Night was quite come when we came in view of the House of Shaws. 10 had been gone some time. It was dark and mild, with a pleasant rustling wind in the southwest that covered the sound of our approach. And as we drew near, we saw no glimmer of light in any portion of the building. It seemed my uncle was already in bed, which was indeed the best thing for our arrangements. We made our last whispered consultation some 50 yards away, and then the lawyer and Torrance and I crept quietly up and crouched down beside the corner of the house. And as soon as we were in our places, Alan strode to the door without concealment and began to knock. For some time he volleyed upon the door, and his knocking only roused the echoes of the house and the neighborhood. At last, however, I could hear the sound of a window gently thrust up, and knew that my uncle had come to his observatory. By what light there was, he would see Alan standing like a dark shadow on the steps. The 3 witnesses were hidden quite out of his view, so that there was nothing to alarm an honest man in his own house. For all that, he studied his visitor a while in silence. And when he spoke, his voice had a quaver of misgiving.
What's this? Says he. This is nae kind of time of night for decent folk, and I hae nae truckings with night hawks. What brings you here? I have a blunderbuss. Is that yourself, Mr. Balfour? Returned Alan, stepping back and looking up into the darkness. Have a care of that blunderbuss. They're nasty things to burst. What brings you here? And where are ye? Says my uncle, angrily. I've no manner of inclination to rout out my name to the countryside, said Alan. What brings me here is another story, being more of your affairs than mine. And if you're sure it's what you would like, I'll set it to a tune and sing it to you. And what is it? Asked my uncle. David, says Alan. What was that? What was that? Cried my uncle in a mighty changed voice. Shall I give you the rest of the name, then? Said Alan. There was a pause, and then, I'm thinking I'll better let you in, says my uncle doubtfully. Oh, I dare say that, said Alan. But the point is, would I go? Now, I will tell you what I'm thinking. I'm thinking that it is here upon this doorstep that we must confer upon this business, and it shall be here or nowhere at all whatever. But I would have you to understand that I am as stiff-necked as yourself, and a gentleman of better family. This change of note disconcerted Ebenezer. He was a little while digesting it, and then says he, Well, what must be must, and shut the window. But it took him a long time to get downstairs, and a little longer to undo the fastenings, repenting, I dare say, and taken with fresh claps of fear at every second step and every bolt and bar. At last, however, we heard the creak of the hinges, and it seems my uncle slipped gingerly out, and seeing that Alan had stepped back a pace or two, sat him down on the top doorstep with a blunderbuss ready in his hands. And now, says he, mind, I have my blunderbuss, and if you take a step nearer, you're as good as dead. And a very civil speech, says Alan, to be sure. Arne? Nay, says my uncle. But this is no very chancy kind of proceeding, and I'm bound to be prepared. And now that we understand each other, you'll You can name your business.
Why, says Alan, you that are a man of so much understanding would doubtless have perceived that I am a Highland gentleman. My name has nae business in my story, but the county of my friends is no very far from the Isle of Mull, of which you will have heard.
It seems there was a ship lost in those parts, and the next day a gentleman of my family was seeking wreckwood for his fire along the sands when he came upon a lad that was half drowned. Well, he brought him to, and he and some other gentlemen took and clapped him in an old ruined castle, where from that day to this he's been a great expense to my friends. My friends are a wee wild-like, and not so particular about the lore as some that I could name. And finding that the lad owned some decent folk and was your born nephew, Mr. Balfour, they asked me to give you a bit of a call and to confer upon the matter. And I must tell you at the off-go, unless we can agree upon some terms, you're little likely to set eyes upon him. For my friends, added Alan simply, are no very well off. My uncle cleared his throat. I'm no very caring, says he. He wasn't a good lad at the best of it, and I've no call to interfere. Aye, said Alan. I see what you would be at, pretending you don't care to make the ransom smaller. Oh, nay, said my uncle. No, it's the mere truth. I take no matter of interest in the lad, and I'll pay no ransom, and you can make a kirk and a mill of him for what I care. Well, see here, said Alan. You dinna want the lad back. Well, what do you want done with him? And how much will you pay? My uncle made no answer, but shifted uneasily on his seat. Come, sir, cried Alan. I would have you to ken that I'm a gentleman. Either give me an answer in civility, and that out of hand, or by the top of Glencoe I will ram 3 feet of iron through your vitals. Hey, man, cried my uncle, scrambling to his feet. Give me a minute. What's like wrong with you? I'm just a plain man and a dancing master, and I'm trying to be as civil as it's morally possible. As for that wild talk, it's fair disreputable. Vitals, says you, and where would I be with my blunderbuss? Powder in your old hands are but as the snail to the swallow against the bright steel in the hands of Alan, said the other. Before your juttering finger could find the trigger, the hilt would dirl on your breastbone. Hey, man, who's denying it? Said my uncle. Put it as you please. Have it your own way. I'll do nothing to cross you. Just tell me what you'll be wanting, and you'll see that we can agree fine. Troth, sir, said Alan. I ask for nothing but plain dealing. In 2 words, do you want the lad killed or kept? Sirs, cried Ebenezer. Oh, sirs, me, that's no kind of a language. Killed or kept, repeated Alan. Oh, or kept, kept, wailed my uncle. We'll may have bloodshed if you please. Well, says Alan, as you please, but that'll be dearer. The dearer? The dearer, cries Ebenezer. Would you file your hands with crime? Hoot, said Alan, they're both crime whatever, and the killing's easier and quicker and surer. I'll have him kept, though, returned my uncle. I've never had nothing to do with anything morally wrong, and I'm no going to begin to pleasure a wild Highlandman. Well, said Alan. And now about the price. It's no very easy for me to set a name upon it. I would first have to ken some small matters. I would have to ken, for instance, what you gave Hoseason at the first off-go. Hoseason! Cries my uncle, struck aback. Hoseason? What for? For kidnapping David, says Alan. It's a lie! It's a black lie, cried my uncle. He was never kidnapped. He lied in his throat that told you that. Kidnapped, or he never was. That's no fault of mine, nor yet of yours, said Alan. Nor yet of Hoseason's. if he's a man that can be trusted. What do you mean? Cried Ebenezer. Did Hoseason tell you? Why, you're done it, old runt. How else would I ken? Cried Alan. Hoseason and me are partners. We gang shares. So you can see for yourself what good you can do by lying. And the point in hand is just this. What did you pay him? Has he told you himself? Oh, well, said my uncle, I didn't care what he said. He lied. And the solemn God's truth is this, that I gave him £20. But I'll be perfectly honest with you. For by that, he was to have the selling of the lard in Carolina. Well, it would be as muckle mair, but no from my pocket, you see. Thank you, Mr. Thompson. That will do excellently well, said the lawyer, stepping forward. And then mighty civilly, good evening, Mr. Balfour, said he. And good evening, Uncle Ebenezer, said I. Never a word, said my uncle, neither black nor white, but just sat there, where he was on the top doorstep, and stared upon us like a man turned to stone. Alan filched away his blunderbuss, and the lawyer, taking him by the arm, plucked him up from the doorstep, led him into the kitchen, whither we all followed, and set him down in a chair beside the hearth, where the fire was out, and only a rushlight burning. There we all looked upon him for a while, exulting greatly in our success, but yet with a sort of pity for the man's shame. Come, Mr. Ebenezer, said the lawyer. You must not be downhearted, for I promise you we shall make easy terms. In the meanwhile, give us the cellar key, and Torrance shall draw us a bottle of your father's wine in honor of the event. And then, turning to me and taking me by the hand, Mr. David, says he, I wish you all joy in your good fortune, which I believe to be well deserved.